record. Okay. All right. Let me move this out of the way. Okay. Hello, class. We'll be presenting on gender inequality in South Korea. Firstly, I'd just like to provide a brief overview of gender equality in South Korea. We'll talk about the Global Gender Gap Index, which South Korea obtains of 0.689. The Global Gender Gap Index takes in 4 key dimensions, which are the economy, education, health, and politics. Economic participation is defined as an individual's engagement to work and or education, and their access to economic resources that results from such participation. I'd like to highlight how this is not necessarily just about the presence of said resources, but an agent's access to these resources, and it definitely contributes to their social well-being. Another factor is economic opportunity. That's basically just an individual's ability to reach economic stability and autonomy. Next, we have educational attainment. We have secondary and post-secondary school. Some people call this high school, and tertiary education, depending on where you live. And next we have health and survival, which may be pertaining to how women and men face different inequalities within the healthcare system. This is evaluated on a scale of 0 to 1, with 0 being a significant lack of gender parity and 1 being fully, a country would be, or there would be a fair enough balance between men and women in a country if they obtained a 1 on the Gender Global Index, in the Global Gender Gap Index. For South Korea, they are doing very bad in political empowerment with a score of 0.212. Interestingly enough, they have great educational attainment and health and survival in this index, as South Korean women are very educated. And then I guess next we'll go into the female to male earnings gap ratio of 64.6, meaning South Korean women make 64.1 cents, or about 65 cents on every dollar that a South Korean male makes. But one positive thing is that South Korean women are increasingly joining the workforce. And I'd like to note that this gap applies across occupations. And this is data from the OECD, which is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And I'll pass it on to Serena.
Okay, so as Bryson said, one success towards gender equality in South Korea is education. So out of the OECD countries, South Korean women actually have the highest level of tertiary education attainment, which is around 66% in 2018. And then from the graph, you can see that they actually surpassed the tertiary education rates of Korean men in 2004. So this is important because higher education contributes to higher wages for women. And Berger, Ruthius, and John found that in the period from 1980 to 1991, education and experience actually accounted for all of the increase in women's wage. So if you look at the yellow highlights, the average log wage gap between men and women decreased from 0.82 in 1980 to 0.62 in 1991. And the portion of this gap that could be explained by education and experience decreased from 0.61 to 0.44, which are the pink highlights, while the part attributed to wage discrimination remained unchanged at 0.12, which are the blue highlights. And this basically means that the reduction in the gender gap was primarily driven by improvements in women's education and experience rather than a decrease in wage discrimination. So education, or women's educational attainment, was definitely a major factor in them, or in the wage gap starting to close, rather than a decrease in discrimination. And then another success is fertility rate. This is kind of a complicated success because fertility is a very concerning demographic issue for South Korea. So they have the lowest fertility rate in the world at 0.78, which is far below the replacement rate of 2.1. And the government has passed several policies unsuccessfully attempting to raise the fertility rate. But the low fertility rate has actually been a good thing in terms of gender equality, since the lower fertility rate is a significant factor in women's increasing labor force participation. So according to the neoclassical model of labor supply, a woman with fewer children or no children will have a lower reservation wage than a woman with more children, since the opportunity cost of her working will be lower. And so Chun and Oh found that having an additional child reduces the probability of married women's labor force participation in Korea by 27.5%. And then having an additional child past 2 children reduces their labor force participation by almost 40%. So the lower fertility rate in South Korea is a good thing in terms of moving towards closing the labor force participation gap.
One of the biggest barriers in South Korea is the current general social environment. In South Korea, the feminist movement is viewed as an extremist stance and often taken as being anti-male. There's a heavy anti-feminist counter movement going on, and a lot of women hesitate to label themselves as feminists, even when supporting women's rights, because it's seen as such an extremist label and a controversial position to take. Last year in 2022, conservative President Yoon was elected using a lot of this anti-feminist rhetoric as part of his platform, and even went as far to pledge to get rid of the Ministry of Gender Equality and Family, saying that he wants to take a non-gendered approach to the issues going on in South Korea, and even said he believes this will help women and families in the long run. This has come about as a partial scapegoat response to the shrinking job market and the increase in cost of living going on in Korea, specifically in Seoul. A lot of younger people aren't able to find good paying jobs, and when they are, they still aren't able to obtain the standard of living that they wish for and that they've seen their parents had in past generations. And when they're looking out at the job market and what's changed between then and now, they see a lot more women in the labor force, and it's become easy for men to blame this as being the cause for a lot of the issues they're having right now. If you look at the chart right here, it shows that in South Korea, men in their 20s are actually far less likely to consider themselves as feminists and even to identify as, and they're more likely to identify as anti-feminists than the older generations of men. And this also goes back to the heavy Confucianist background in the South Korea, which emphasizes the man as the head of the household and the women as the place being in the home and being underneath the man. There's a high pressure on men to be able to provide for their families and be the head of household. Now that they're not able to be the head of household, they're not able to start families, and they're looking for a person to blame for this, and it falls a lot on women. So there's a lot of sexist undertones within society going on currently.
Another barrier to gender equality in South Korea is the devastating motherhood penalty. As you can see in the graph to the right, the bottom graph displays how as women in South Korea have more children, they are taxed, and we refer to this as a motherhood penalty, which may influence a woman's wages, their ability to get hired, or even their ability to obtain a promotion. Wages usually drop for women after they re-enter the workforce, after birthing a child, if they are even allowed to do so. And then women also receive less promotions in South Korea after bearing a child, as women are perceived as less dedicated to their job once they have a child. I also kind of wanted to touch on the fatherhood premium that you see present in South Korea. And fathers' wages and the number of children they have are positively correlated, I'd say, as men with 0 children who are not fathers have the lowest wage rate, while those with 1 and more than 2 children have the highest wages. I'll go ahead and hop into this next slide.
Okay, so to combat this problem that we're seeing, our group decided that South Korea should have greater childcare subsidies. So currently in South Korea, there are some subsidies provided, but they act mostly as an encouragement for women to fall pregnant. So they're in the form of one-time rewards for pregnancy rather than to support women raising a child alongside a job. So there's currently a 1 million won reward for pregnancy, which is about $755, and an allowance of $275 a month for infants under a year old. But as the child gets older, so literally from 13 months onwards, it's only $74 a month until age 7. So what Korea currently has is more of a fertility encouraging measure rather than a gender equality promoting measure. So this needs to be expanded to something more meaningful, like a more useful level of subsidies. Alongside this, there's also a rapidly climbing cost of living in South Korea, so higher subsidies will make it more manageable to have a family. Additionally, South Korean women, as we discussed previously, are very highly educated women, but find themselves stuck in part-time work a lot of the time. So hopefully this will make the transition into full-time or higher paid work more feasible. And then finally, as a reinforcement to this policy, we wanted to set up some kind of auditing scheme to hold companies accountable for providing the paid parental leave that they say they will. So separate from child subsidies in South Korea, there is mandatory paid leave, but there is no way of checking up on this, especially after the abolishment of the Gender Equality Ministry in the government. So as a result, only around 43% of companies actually comply with these rules. So obviously that acts as a barrier to women attaining and maintaining their job, especially coming out of part-time into full-time work. So we're looking to improve that alongside our subsidies so that women don't have to forego the paid work they're doing, or so that they're not forced to take on part-time work instead, which is what we're currently seeing. Okay, and then Kira will explain how that will work.
Yeah. So we chose to model the introduction of childcare subsidies using this neoclassical model of labor supply. And we can see in the graph, we have a red indifference curve, indifference curve 0, and indifference curve 1 in green. And 0 depicts this woman who has all these incentives to get pregnant, these fertility incentives. But then once she is pregnant, time at home is incredibly difficult to substitute. There's high cost of living and incredibly high costs of daycare. And so her reservation wage to stay in or to enter the labor force is incredibly high. So we have her here at her endowment point where she is not actually in the labor force at all because time at home is so difficult to substitute. And that's a really steep indifference curve. And we see this in the data with the majority of mothers exiting the labor force after their first childbirth, if they were in the labor force. And we've referenced earlier how each increasing child makes a woman more and more likely to exit the labor force. So we can really see how having children makes it really difficult for women in South Korea to keep their jobs. But once we increase these childcare subsidies and enact these policies we've discussed, we see the indifference curves flying because increased market substitutability and increased availability of market substitutes makes time at home much easier to substitute, and the indifference curve gets flatter. And we see our woman in this graph move up her budget constraint and her time at home decrease greatly, and she joins the labor force. So our hope with this is that women who were in the labor force before pregnancy and before childbirth remain in the labor force, which allows them to continue to acquire human capital, and maybe will help decrease this devastating motherhood penalty that we see. And as Emma said about the amount of women being in low paid and part-time jobs, maybe women being allowed to stay in those jobs during maternity will allow them to increase that skill set and get higher earning jobs in the future, thus reducing this motherhood penalty that we've seen.
Those are our works cited, but other than that, that's our presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Staub, please have a great day.